This video is about Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee and the decision he made at the start of the Civil War. The Civil War is, as many of you know, the most horrific war in American history. It took a massive number of American servicemen, both in the North and the South. Robert E. Lee played a huge part in that. What you're looking at right now are images of Arlington Cemetery, and this is the former home of Robert E. Lee. At the start of the Civil War, there were lots of choices that Robert E. Lee could have made, and we're going to look at the choice that he did make and what choices were available to him. We're not going to hear it from my perspective. We're going to hear it from the perspective of a park ranger. Thousands upon thousands of folks lost their lives. Young men and women all up and down the East Coast died for a cause. And that could have been a lot different had Robert E. Lee made a different choice. So the question really that we need to answer is what options were available to him at the time and what information did he know? And we're going to look at two individuals, one who you know, Robert E. Lee, and another whom you do not. And I'd like to point out the striking differences between the two choices, and it also explains how Arlington Cemetery became Arlington Cemetery. So let's listen to a park ranger explain the choices that Robert E. Lee had at the start of the Civil War.
I think that he kind of overshadows all the other important people, not only at the Arlington house, but even at the cemetery itself. For example, have we heard the name Montgomery Meigs? No? All right. So now I get to introduce you all Montgomery Meigs in the next 20 minutes or so. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm going to introduce you to another man who had a friendship with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was born and raised here in Virginia, not too far from here. Alexandria was his hometown, so about 15 minutes from here. And in 1829, Robert E. Lee graduated from West Point Military Academy. He was second to top of his class, and he had no demerits, which in today's terms is sort of like behavior points. So he had no behavior points against him, and he was second top of his class. Remember, this is a young country, so you want the best top-tier officers to overlook and direct, supervise the construction of railroad systems, transportation systems, federal buildings. These guys were going to be put in charge of it. So Lee gets assigned to what is today known as the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Army Corps of Engineers. Well, Montgomery Meigs was also born in a state that would later defect or secede to the Confederacy. He was born in Augusta, Georgia, and he had a deep admiration for the United States military. At 16 years old, he enlists in the Army, and he graduates from West Point near the top of his class, and he too would then be assigned to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. He graduates in 1836, and his first assignment is to report to St. Louis to help navigation along the Mississippi River. So St. Louis was a lot smaller at this time, and they needed improving their harbors and navigation with the Mississippi River running right through the city. So, fresh out of West Point, reports to St. Louis. Who do you think his commanding officer is when he checks in at St. Louis? Robert E. Lee. Only makes sense, right? So he reports to St. Louis, young, eager to get his best foot forward in the military, and he reports directly to Robert E. Lee. And he has nothing but good things to say about Robert E. Lee. Describes him as the model officer, the model Christian, the type of man who's admired by all women, respected by all men, all of that kind of stuff. And after their workday is over, the two men start building this friendship because they are spending time in a cabin together. They go out fishing, they go out hunting, and Meigs is writing about how lucky he feels to have someone like Lee to look up to. However, their time in St. Louis would end. The two men are still active duty in the United States Army. Lee comes back here to his home in Virginia, his family. As we all know, he would see combat for the first time during the Mexican War, and has brave service during that war and distinguishes himself through his service in that campaign. Montgomery Meigs would be sent here to Washington, D.C. He would oversee some very important projects. For example, If you live in the area and you have running water, which I hope you do, that comes from Montgomery Meigs. In 1850, he was tasked with getting a fresh water source or a good water source for the young capital city, and so he oversees the construction of the Washington Aqueduct. The Capitol building was a lot smaller then, and that rotunda looked a lot different. Montgomery Meigs was charged with overseeing the Capitol expansion and redesigning the rotunda, as you can see from the front of the house. If you've gone through the home, you would have noticed that in the dining room table, in that panel, Montgomery Meigs is mentioned. And you can see a picture of him there, because we know that he dined here on numerous occasions. And I have found letters where Meigs writes that he invited Lee to his home for dinner or for a gathering. So the two men are not only colleagues in the Army, they're also now friends, buddies. And this is someone that Meigs looks up to. He sees Lee as sort of a mentor. However, in the way that the country was headed, you would see that this friendship, this relationship, this bond that the two men were building would become strained. If I can have you all shout out again, just like you did the first time, what are some emotions you may feel if you felt betrayed by someone?
Anger.
Anger.
Hurt. Sorrow.
Hurt. Sorrow.
Disbelief.
Good ones. Thank you so much. I'll add my own here, and I'll say you might be vengeful. You might want to get back at this person. Thank you. Thank you for your response. So, as I said, the way that the country was headed, the relationship between Lee and Meigs would be strained. In April of 1861, Fort Sumter, a United States Army base in the Charleston Harbor of South Carolina, was attacked. It was bombarded and it was forced to surrender. They were attacked by a newly formed coalition of states known as the Confederate States of America. After Fort Sumter surrenders, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to help and come put down this rebellion. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina refused. Not only were they not going to provide President Lincoln with any men, they too are now done with the Union. They would be the last 4 states to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Within days, one of President Lincoln's aides comes to Arlington House to offer Robert E. Lee command of the entire United States Army. Not a regiment, not a battalion, not a unit, not a platoon, the entire United States Army. But Robert E. Lee refuses. He says no. He could not see himself fighting against Virginia, and not only is he going to refuse, he too will resign, leave this home, eventually goes down to Richmond and takes command of the Northern Virginian Confederate Army, which was the main Confederate army in the Eastern Theater during the Civil War. It was fighting for the Confederacy against the United States, almost winning the war for the Confederacy. But while Lee was doing that, while he was waging war against the United States, his home here was changing. Who's been out to the front of the house? You got the pictures there, the best view of Washington, D.C. that you'll see on this side of the Potomac. But in 1861, that's a dangerous view. If the Confederacy was able to bombard and force Fort Sumter, an actual base, to surrender, what would stop them from rolling up some rifled cannons and having their way with the capital city? Shelling near enough to the White House to cause havoc. And so General Winfield Scott, also a Virginian, urges President Lincoln to send troops to Arlington. And the troops come. They come through Alexandria, where Lee grew up. They come onto Arlington, and they make a sort of makeshift fort around the home. The officers then occupy the house, using it as a headquarters space. They break in, they steal things, they break things. Typical stuff that young men do when they're unsupervised, and this is their enemy's home after all. And Montgomery Meigs is now the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. Quartermaster General, in layman's terms, would be a logistics officer. So the uniforms, the boots, the mules, the horses, the wagons, the food, the weapons, the rounds that they were using, the cannons, would be procured and overseen by Montgomery Meigs and his department. So he was running the logistics for the Union war machine. And one of his tasks as quartermaster was to find burial spaces. This Civil War is becoming a lot deadlier, and the bodies are piling up in Washington, D.C. They're running out of room to bury these dead soldiers. So Montgomery Meigs says to President Lincoln, "Mr. President, we have all this once disgraced land. Why not bring honor to it by burying our dead soldiers here?" And you may be thinking disgrace, it's a little harsh, but remember, this is someone who he saw as a friend, someone who he thought was honest, sincere, loyal. But Lee decided that his loyalties lie elsewhere, not with the country. A man that he invited to his own home and came here to his own home to have dinner with him and his family is now fighting for the other side against the country. He comes here one summer afternoon to see how the burials are going, and the officers are burying the dead soldiers. In the far corner of the plantation, what's today known as Section 27, over by the Marine Corps Memorial. And Meigs says, nope, this is not good enough. So he oversees that 26 graves are dug right along Mrs. Lee's rose garden. He wants the burials to take place as close to the house as possible so that the Lees can never come back. And if the Lees ever do come back, they'll have a daily reminder of the lives that have been cost for fighting with the Confederacy against the United States. To make matters even worse, one October evening, Meigs is given the horrible, horrible news that his own son, a 22-year-old second lieutenant, John Rogers Meigs, also a West Point graduate, also an engineer, has been murdered in Shenandoah. And I need to differentiate why I use murder and not killed, because he was not killed in battle. He was well within Union lines. He confronted a group of men on horseback. They were wearing blue Union uniforms, and when he gets close enough, they reveal themselves to be Confederate scouts. They try to capture him. He pulls out a weapon to defend himself, and they murder him. And this hurts Meigs so bad that he issues a $1,000 bounty for the man that he believes is responsible for murdering his son. He blames Lee directly for all of this, for choosing to fight with the Confederacy against your country. And so he then buries his son in Section 1 of the cemetery, right on the other side of that grassy hill there, about 200 yards away from Lee's home. After all of this, eventually Robert E. Lee would be forced to surrender. He surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant out at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and the Civil War slowly starts coming to an end. Robert E. Lee would spend the rest of his life, his remaining years, as an educator at Washington and Lee University, and that is where he is buried. Lexington, Virginia, not too far from here, but that is where he spends his remaining years. Montgomery Meigs continues to serve in the United States Army. He's forced to retire at 65 years old, and then he too would be buried in Section 1 right beside his son here at Arlington. It's important that we note that between 1861 to 1865, 620,000 American men lost their lives. And that number is almost equal to the amount of American fatalities during the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. 7 different wars in just 4 years. Same amount of deaths. And I'll take the last 3 or 4 minutes to explain why I chose to talk about Montgomery Meigs and focus more on his side of the story, because like I said, the controversy, the overshadowing figure that Lee is, a lot of other stories kind of don't get much attention as they should. And loyalty is something that's important to me, because my family is not from this country. My family immigrated to the United States from Mexico. I was just lucky enough to be born here. But I remember at 8 years old, my parents taking the naturalization oath. And what you do when you're doing that is that you're stating that you're forgiving any ties to the foreign country. You no longer have any allegiance to that country. You are now going to be a lawfully abiding citizen of the United States. You're going to support the Constitution of the United States. 10 years later, at 18 years old, I took a similar oath when I decided to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. And you go in front of an officer in this room, and there's the big, beautiful American flag and the flag of the military branches. And you're taking an oath that you will support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, in 1829, one man took his oath. 1836, the other man took his. Yet in 1861, one man remained loyal to his oath while the other went back on it. One man remained loyal to his country while the other decided that his loyalties lie elsewhere. One man continued to serve in the United States Army while the other actively took arms against it. Yet today, one man has a memorial in his name, and the other, many of us hadn't heard of him until the last 10, 15 minutes. So I ask all of you to think about this as you're making your way through Arlington National Cemetery or the National Mall and all the other cool sites in DC. You're learning about all these important men and women who have done so much, worked so hard to make this country as great as it is today. Who do you owe your loyalty to? Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all these wonderful responses. Thank you so much.